Hello and welcome to Ways to Change the World. I'm Krishnan Murthy, and this is the podcast in which we talk to extraordinary people about the big ideas in their lives and the events that have helped shape them. But it is US election week, and events are changing by the hour, and they are shaping us all. My guest this week has spent much of his life trying to change the world and make it a better place, but he has been a policy wonk in Britain, working in Tony Blair's Downing Street. He was then a frontline politician. He became Foreign Secretary under Gordon Brown. He wanted to be leader of the Labour Party, but he just missed out on that. And then he left British politics, moved to America, and now runs an international charity, the International Rescue Committee, which deals with refugees all around the world. I'm talking, of course, about David Miliband. Hi, David. How are you?
Hi, Krishnan. Very nice to be with you on this sleep-deprived week.
You know, we are recording this on Thursday. It's a couple of days after the results started coming out, and it looks like Donald Trump is on his way out of the White House and Joe Biden is on his way in. We can't be certain of that. Anything could yet happen, but I guess we have to work on that basis. Do you agree?
Yes, it looks like a defeat for Donald Trump, a victory for Joe Biden. A win is always a win, and even when it's not a landslide, it's miles different from a defeat. But it does seem that if Vice President Biden wins Arizona, if he wins Georgia, which now looks likely, and adds it to the Rust Belt states, so-called, he'll have more or less the same number of electoral college votes as President Trump had in 2016. So I think it is a defeat for Donald Trump. I don't think we can say it's a repudiation of Trumpism. Larry Summers, the former Treasury Secretary, talks about two repudiation elections in American 20th century history: 1932, which rejected austerity when it elected Franklin Roosevelt; 1980, when it rejected government and embraced Ronald Reagan. Some people thought that 2020 might be a repudiation election. It doesn't look like that. It looks like a defeat for President Trump, but the battle remains in a very polarized and divided country about its values and about its direction.
Are you surprised that it's not a repudiation? I mean, you obviously live in America, so you're a little bit closer to the way people there feel. Certainly in Britain, a large amount of the population here just find it unbelievable that America isn't appalled by the Trump administration and wouldn't want to get him out. It's just not the way huge numbers of Americans feel, is it?
You're right. I mean, I knew that American voters were never in the same category as UK or German or other European. You see 85% of people saying in polls they'd vote against Donald Trump in European countries. It clearly wasn't the case in America, but I am surprised that President Trump has increased his absolute number of votes and increased his vote share. I mean, he will end up this election, it seems, with 47-48% of the vote, which is a hell of a lot of people, especially on a larger turnout.
Does that suggest he has changed the world?
Well, I think he's changed America. That's certainly true. And what the next few years will show is whether or not there is willingness, and ability to change the world in an alternative direction. I mean, he's certainly been what Richard Haas of the Council on Foreign Relations calls the author of the withdrawal doctrine, the idea that America should isolate itself from international institutions and international agreements. He's also changed American politics. I think that's probably an important aspect. And one of the most remarkable things, or one of the most things I think is incredibly important to come to terms with, is that although he's violated many of the quote-unquote norms and laws of American politics, he's actually reinforced the support amongst his own base. He hasn't, if anything, the ardor for him is greater. And now there's also greater polarization. I think that the challenge for a Biden administration, especially if it comes in with a Republican Senate, is whether or not it's going to be able to do the kind of reinvention that I think Vice President Biden, soon to be President Biden, it seems, says he wants to do.
But do you know what Trumpism is? I mean, is it really just about his personality? Is that what inspires people? Or is it actually a bigger thing? Are there ideas there that you can latch onto?
I think there are two aspects to this. One set of aspects related to his personality, the atavistic, deep, emotional, leading with the gut element of his own personality, his own flawed personality, someone who just is not ashamed of his own flaws. And I think there's a very interesting question about the extent to which his own flaws allow him to do things that other politicians who might have similar policy positions but don't have the same flaws, whether they'll get the same reaction from the voters. So the first is the atavistic personal element. The second element, though, is a group of views which I don't think one can dismiss or say don't have substance. I mean, they are views about the place of America in the world. They're views about the values that should guide America. They're views, something that I'm particularly interested in. The American Republic was founded on the idea that the ends do not justify the means, that the constitutional republic established blocks on executive power because it wants to protect minorities from majority rule. That's out of the window when you think about the Trump worldview. So I think there are some policy positions, whether in respect of tax or climate change. There are some particular American aspects to do with the debates about abortion that don't really have resonance elsewhere. But the nationalism and the nativism and the impunity is real. And that's something that I think is shared with I don't particularly like the term populist, but it's shared with politicians in other parts of the world who have not necessarily wanted to say President Trump is their model, but there are certainly affinities with his brand of politics.
He's given them hope, hasn't he, and a model of how to operate.
Well, here's the interesting thing. I think that remains to be seen, because if you look at what the scholars of, let's call it authoritarian nationalism or authoritarian populism, if you look at what the scholars say, the people who really study this, they will tell you that to be defeated on your first go is very, very significant. That it's usually in a second term that authoritarian populists go much, much further. And one can think of places around the world where that has been the case. So one school of thought would say that the defeat of President Trump is more significant than anything else, that the fact that he was rebuffed on his first attempt at re-election is a very significant departure. The other side of the coin, and this remains very open, is that actually the fact that he got this 48% of the vote, record numbers of votes, means that Trumpism is going to continue to dominate the Republican Party. It's going to be hard for Republicans to cleave away from it. And it may well be that in 4 years' time, President Trump decides that he's still younger than Joe Biden is today and decides to run again.
Well, yes, I mean, that's what I was asking you about in terms of what you latch onto. I mean, can there be Trumpism without Trump? Or would it have to go to his son or, Ivanka or?
Well, I think that if you think about the contingent aspects of the campaign, the way he campaigned, his determination to just brush off the COVID threat, that was undoubtedly distinctive to him. But the sense of energy, vitality, drive for every vote undoubtedly, or I would submit, helped him in the last couple of weeks. It gave a vitality to his campaign. It embodied his campaign. I think, though, clearly there is Trumpism without Trump. Whether it will be as successful is a very open question, because as I was saying earlier, the flaws of his own character, in a way, are part of the offer that he's making to voters.
Is there anything you've looked at in Donald Trump as a politician or a former politician and thought, that's really good, I wish I could do that, or I could learn from that?
Well, let me say some things something that I think is surprising. It may sound surprising. I thought 4 years ago he was an extraordinarily, and don't laugh at this, his message discipline 4 years ago was extraordinarily strong. I mean, he ran for 15 or 18 months for the primary and then for the general election with extraordinary message discipline about immigration and the wall, about refusing to pay for other people's benefit and withdraw from international engagement, about, thirdly, the fact that he was a businessman and could fix the economy. For his ability and his willingness to stick to a message when many people get bored with their own message and they move on to something else, of course, that's fatal. I think you would say that 4 years ago, he was an extraordinary message politician. That broke down in the last, I would say, 6 months. And his campaign was not characterized by that sort of message discipline. But I think you've got to have a sense of that.
So when you look at what happens elsewhere in Britain, obviously there are similarities between Boris Johnson's Conservative Party and Donald Trump's administration. And there are other obvious European examples. Do you think this will have a chastening effect? Will it change the way they behave? Or might they look at these results and go, you know what, it was really close?
I think the believers will think there's more to this. Now, the flip side is that there's plenty of room for the Democrats to grow now here. There's plenty of room for them to go further into communities they've won. I think the victories in Michigan, Wisconsin, it would have been alleged some time ago that Democrats had to choose between essentially blue collar and white collar, what used to be called blue collar and white collar. They're building a new coalition, which is blue collar in the old reindustrializing parts of America. Pittsburgh vote, it's now the software capital in some ways. It seems to have delivered a very big vote, but also Arizona, Denver, suburban America has come out very strongly for President Trump. It's the economically rising counties of the country that seem to have delivered the victory to Vice President Biden. So I think that the believers will want to choose their own message, but I think that it's still all to play for. I don't think you can say one way or the other which is definitive. It's still got to be worked through, because I can't think of a time. I first came to America 30 or 40 years ago, and it's now more than one country. It really feels like different countries within the same geographical borders.
Well, then let's look at the flip side of that. Is there, we've talked over the years about, and I don't know whether it's a real thing or not, to be honest, but the progressive consensus in the Western world. If Joe Biden has rolled over Donald Trump in this election, does that mean that, things could swing the other way in Britain and in Europe and Australia? And
obviously they could. The question is how and whether. But here's my caution. I am really very leery of anything that sounds like restoration. The idea of going back to a pre-2016, to take the American example, status quo ante. Interestingly, there's a debate within the foreign policy community on the Democratic side about whether restoration or reinvention is the right strategy. I think that goes way beyond foreign policy. And I think those who want to be an alternative to national populists, who end up looking like they're calling for a restoration, are going to fail. Now, in the British case, sadly, tragically, in my view, you can't think about restoration because Brexit is such a clear before and after. There's no going back. But I think the broader point that the alternatives to nationalist, nativist, authoritarianism has to be reinvented. And that seems to me both at the policy level and at the political level. The policy level about the way in which to engage with issues of equality, inequality in the modern world. The political level, I'm really struck how you fight fake news, disinformation in a modern democracy is a fundamental question that 10 years ago you'd have said, well, the truth will out. And those countries that are committed to censorship are bound to fail. What we find today is that those countries committed to censorship have developed surveillance systems that are as good as, and those democracies that thought good will drive out bad look complacent, and good facts drive out bad facts. I mean, the truth is we've got some malign information as well as differences of opinion. And at the moment, how you fight malign information is an unwon battle so far, I would say. Because
at the moment, people can just lie and get away with it. There is no punishment.
Well, they can lie and get away with it. That's the impunity. But it's not just they get away with it. It defines a new reality. It's interesting. It seems that President Trump hasn't quite known what to say over the last 2 days because the latest tweet from him was stop the count. But I think that the ability of misinformation to define a new reality is challenging to the whole notion of democratic discourse.
And that's really happening in Britain already, isn't it? And you can see it happening over COVID.
You call something a declaration, you add a name of a place that you've never heard, you call it the Great Barrington Declaration, you get some people who claim to be scientists with expertise in epidemiology, and Bob's your uncle, and you're off to a new movement. Now, I think that we'll see how that plays out. The truth is that the opinion polling in countries like the UK show quite a skepticism about some of the false claims. But I have to tell you here, there are the balkanization. Balkanization, remember, was a term for the reflected 20th century history at various points of different ethnic groups within a country who can't stand each other and take up arms against each other. Now, political balkanization, where there are not just different tribes, but different information sources, different fact sources, different TV channels, different social media channels, different conversations. The breakdown of the national conversation in America seems to me to be the central challenge to reuniting the country. And I don't see that, for all the good words that Vice President Biden has uttered in terms of governing as an American, not as a Democrat. We're a long way from e pluribus unum, from many into one. This feels like from many into many tribes.
And do you think Boris Johnson is much more truthful?
Well, he's not in the sort of Olympic stakes that President Trump has. He's Champions League, many times over. So I think that here's an interesting difference. I think interesting. The accountability mechanisms in America are not that strong. If you're the president who decides not to answer questions from the media, it's very unclear who holds you accountable. I don't want to kind of deify or glorify prime minister's questions as some kind of gold standard, but the prime minister is accountable. And I mean, I think Boris Johnson has tried to sort of get around some of the other parliamentary engagements with parliamentary committees and things like that. But if you're the president, if you're a cabinet minister in America and the Senate is not in the hands of is in the hands of your own party, the mechanisms of accountability strike me as being very weak. And so bolstering parliamentary democratic conventions and norms seems like a vital part of the transparency that you need, the accountability that you need. My big thing at the moment is impunity versus accountability. I think that's a fundamental divide in the modern world. It's a fundamental divide in domestic politics and in international politics. I run a humanitarian agency, as you know. The ultimate impunity is to kill 2 of my staff who are driving an ambulance in northwest Syria and never be accountable for that. But the impunity exists in the economy, exists in politics, domestic as well as international. And the alternative isn't necessarily democracy, but it's accountability. And power without accountability is the route to hell very, very quickly.
Just flesh out what you mean by accountability, Ben, in that context.
I mean the exercise of power within limits, and the fact that there are checks and balances on the exercise of power rather than impunity in the exercise of power. Impunity is power without responsibility. And you know the hackneyed old phrase, the refuge of harlots throughout the ages is power without responsibility. Apparently it was originally Kipling, but Baldwin used it about the media in the 1930s. And impunity is the ability to take decisions and actions without consequence. And we know enough of human history that quote is that power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think that is the central issue in modern global politics. 113 countries have suffered recession in democratic and political freedom in the last 15 years. And the fight for democracy is far harder because democratic countries look like they're struggling with all sorts of their own problems. China puts a good deal of propaganda into how it's succeeding. COVID has helped them say that. But the exercise of power without responsibility in politics, but frankly also in the economy as well, is the central frame that I see playing out in national and international politics at the moment. And we will live in a runaway world if we are living in a world where there is power without responsibility.
Okay, I want to get to you and sort of wind back quite soon. But before we do that, just because we've got to this point, a lot of people think that we are where we are now because there's a line that goes right from here to the Iraq War. Now, do you think there is some truth in that? That episode, had breakdown of trust between people and politics, whether you think it was lying or untruths or just mistakes, there's some sort of, things happened there that, people were told things that weren't true. And we ended up, with huge loss of life as a result and a breakdown in trust in politics and institutions. I mean, do you accept that sort of analysis?
Well, I've written that the Iraq War has turned out to be a strategic disaster. I've said that many times, but I don't believe it was founded on a lie. I mean, the end of the difference between a lie and a mistake is an example of how things can go wrong. The Iraq War was clearly part of the story of the last 20 years. I think that you can make a much stronger argument that the financial crisis is a bigger part of the story of the last 20 years of politics than you can make that the Iraq War was the start of the story, although both are clearly part of it. I think that if you want to explain the course of politics in the 2010s, the financial crisis of 2008-9 is a bigger factor than the Iraq War.
Why do you say that? I mean, did people blame politicians in the same way for the financial crisis and the fallout of it? I mean, are you talking about austerity when you talk about that?
Well, no, I'm talking about the fact that the financial crisis happened, was allowed to happen, that those who were ultimately responsible for it were perceived not to have been punished for it in the business community, and it affected the lives of every single person in the Western world. We're now living through COVID, which is also affecting the lives of every single person in the world, actually. Whatever you think about the Iraq War and whatever the wrongs of it, it didn't have the same impact on people's lives that the financial crisis did. And I think that the financial crisis also shattered the idea or the link between democracy and prosperity in a very fundamental way. There's this saying, which I recently discovered I quoted at the time, which is that after 1989, capitalism saved China, and after 2009, China saved capitalism. But that's the reason for not forgetting it. I'm not trying to say we should forget about the Iraq War or not discuss it, but I think that the financial crisis is a very big part of the story. And the fact that its seeds were earlier, I mean, the financial crisis didn't come out of a clear blue sky. It came out of a set of conditions that went back into the 90s, really, that while the surface looked good, some of the stagnation of wages was in fact bad. And so I think that there's a longer story to be told there.
Well, let's go back to your own story. You actually ended up running policy in Downing Street in this new Labour government in your late 20s. So how did that happen? I mean, did you grow up wanting to change the world?
I was brought up to think that if you could make a difference, you should, and if you didn't, it was a waste. So I don't know if I wouldn't have put it as in grandiose terms as change the world, but I was brought up with a very strong sense that if you could make a difference, you should.
By both your mother and father, or was that?
Yeah, and I don't think, I mean, I don't want to be a pop psychologist, but they lived through very consequential times. They were both refugees. My dad chased out of Belgium in 1940. You know, by the time he was 21, he'd fled from fascism, from Nazism, and he had served in the Navy, and he'd fought fascism, but he'd also seen Stalinism coming from the former Soviet Union. My mum came to the UK as a 12-year-old in 1946. So they obviously sheltered, or not obviously, they did shelter us in a way, because they didn't force out, they didn't tell us every day, look how lucky you are, how much worse it was for me when I was a 12-year-old. There was none of that. But I'm sure that they tried to shelter us, but they also conveyed a sense that they had seen unutterable danger and threat, some of it too awful to speak about. And in the case of my mother's father, who we never talked about how he perished, and it was only the year before last that we discovered the concentration camp in southwest Germany where he'd been killed. So there was I guess somewhere pop psychology, you'd say that if you don't stand up and make a difference, then bad things, troubles around the corner. But I did. The truth is, how did I end up in Downing Street in 1997? 32 I was then, so I wasn't quite in my 20s.
Oh, okay.
It was luck, really. I mean, Tony Blair became leader after the tragedy of John Smith's heart attack in 1994, and he asked me to head up the policy shop for the Leader Opposition, which I did in 94 for 3 years. And then we worked hard on the idea that we had to be ready for government. And we had 175 promises in our manifesto, 174 in our manifesto for the 97 election, and we went about putting them into practice.
But how did you know Tony Blair at that stage in your life?
I mean, the truth is that I met him a couple of times. He'd been Shadow Employment Secretary. I was working for the Institute of Public Policy Research. I was the secretary of the Social Justice Commission, which was set up by John Smith to reinvent policy towards the welfare state. And so I guess he'd heard about me in some sort of vague way. And when he became leader, he was casting around for someone who could head up his policy shop. I think Tom Sawyer, who was then General Secretary of the party, said, "Hey, you should talk to this guy, David Miliband. He'll do you right." So it was real luck.
And did you have a very strong sense that you were part of something big in 97, once you'd won, that you were going to have to deliver real change?
Yes, definitely. I mean, there was a serious...
it must have been terrifying.
Well, no, because what there was a real sense that if we'd lost again, that would have been 5 times running. But there was also a very strong sense, if we win, but then screw up, then that's almost the worst conceivable outcome. Not quite, but almost. So, Tony was very, very good at this in saying, look, I don't want to put anything in the manifesto that's a vote loser, but I also don't want to put anything in there that we're not going to be able to do, because we are going to have to deliver. And so I think we delivered 169 of the 174 promises that we put into our manifesto. We'd actually done the work. And the theory of the case was that we're more likely to win if we've got a credible program for government. And so the alignment of our strategy for opposition with our strategy for government was real. Why
did you decide to make the move into frontline politics?
I'd always thought of myself as a backroom person, but essentially Tony got a bit sick of me after 7 years and said, look, you should go, and he took me out into the Downing Street garden and said, look, you should try this. You should do it. You'll enjoy it. You'll learn from it. And you might turn out to be good at it. And so, and he was certainly right about the first, which is I learned a huge amount from it. And, I became incredibly attached to my constituency, which was in South Shields in the northeast of England. We still have a house there. Our kids, would go there each weekend. We'd go there in the summer. We still go there in the summer, although we couldn't this summer. So it was a great experience. And I surprised myself. I never forget, that as a candidate, a bespectacled candidate at the Cleveland Working Men's Club in South Shields in 1997, in 2001, sort of standing on the stage in the middle of 2 bands, people playing bingo and dominoes in this club, me trying to explain myself. It's sort of deep red in a British sense constituency. You learn what's real and how to engage with people in a serious way.
But did you have that sense that if you actually want to, that you could make more change as a politician than you could as a policy person?
Yeah, definitely. And you also got the sense of the different way. If you're on the outside of politics, all you see is the public presentation. If you're on the inside of politics, which I was as a backroom person, you can see the different aspects of political personality, political success that are important. And so I got a taste for it, and a sense that there were aspects of it that I might be able to do well. And so, look, there's no question, if you can make it to being a government minister, you've got more power in that position than almost in any other. Certainly more power than if you're running an NGO. I never kid myself about that. But you also face bigger obstacles. So the power is greater, but the obstacles are bigger. What I say to people now is, in an NGO, leading an NGO, the power is less, but the obstacles are less.
Given where you came from and your dad's politics, famous as a Marxist intellectual, why aren't you more left-wing than you are?
Well, maybe because I got mugged by reality. I mean, my dad was 21 in 1945. He'd seen fascism. There was communism to the east. He'd served in the armed forces for 3 years. I was 21 in 1985. I'd lived a middle-class life in London and in Leeds. I mean, it's a different world, really. But I don't want to make excuses for that. It's not an excuse. It's a description of reality. And I think a lot of the assumptions about it, there's nothing particularly left-wing in my view about thinking that nationalisation is a left-wing thing. It's not particularly. I think that I'd like to think my politics are based on what I've learned, and as well as how I was brought up and what I see.
So what drove you as a politician? What was your deep ambition for people?
The easiest way to express that is to say that every day when I was Minister for Schools, when I was Secretary of State for the Environment, when I was Foreign Secretary, but also as a Member of Parliament, what drove me was an absolute commitment to social justice, and allied to a sense that if you have power, you should use it with responsibility to make a difference for social justice. And I was the Secretary of the Social Justice Commission, which undoubtedly fed into that, remember, in the early 90s. But absolutely was my view that people I'd been at school with had as much talent as I did, but they left school at 15 without doing their exams, or O-levels at the time, because they had to go and care for a parent, in the case of one kid I was at school with, because they had to go to work in the case of another. And I saw the idea that inequality of opportunity, inequality of outcome fed off each other in a way that offended every part of my being. And so in all of my political roles, I wanted to do something about that. I wanted to tackle inequality of opportunity, and to do something about that, you had to also tackle inequality of outcome. But social justice was the way in which I reconciled in my own mind that equality was also about social issues, not just about economic issues. It was about inequalities of gender and sexuality and race. And it was about how you build a decent society. And that just drove me. I can honestly say it drove me every day. Every day I went into, I can't remember why last week there was something came up about when I was Minister for Schools and the decisions we were making then. Our starting point every morning was the schools that were furthest behind. What can we do to help them get ahead? Now, sometimes that meant, what can we learn from the best schools? But undoubtedly, that was what drove the decisions that we took. I know why it was. There was something last week about the capital projects going to different constituencies in the UK, in the media. I can't remember what it exactly.
Yeah.
And I just remember back to the Building Schools for the Future program, which was all about helping the least advantaged first.
And so when you compare your life now and your life then, I mean, your life now, I guess it's easier to sort of look at individual tangible things in which you're changing, people's lives that you're changing. How do you compare, running a massive NGO in which you're helping people in quite simple and basic ways and very complex ways, and politics, which is inevitably laced with success, failure, media portrayal, spin, and all those other things?
Look, it's different ends of the telescope. If you're in politics, you've got a bird's eye view, and the danger is that you get removed from reality. If you're running an NGO, you've got a ground level view, but the danger is you can't see the wood for the trees. And what I've tried to do every day at the IRC, at the International Rescue Committee, is join real attention to detail. My next meeting is about how do we make sure our local partnerships are really giving us impact and scale. I was talking this morning to a government minister in a country that gives us money about how we can do more on sexual and reproductive health for women displaced by war. I'm speaking to our Ethiopia team. I've just spoken to our Ethiopia team about how they deal with the growing military challenges. You've got to have the ground level routing. You've got to be able to make a difference in the micro. But if you lose sight of the macro, then you're not going to be able to have the impact that you need.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose when you weigh up, 7 years in politics, 7 years something focused helping refugees, do you find yourself going, in which one did I do the most good?
Not often, but sometimes people say that. I mean, look, I was in elected politics for 12 years. We put out the world's first legally binding 44-year emissions reduction agreement that became the Climate Change Act. We helped London go from being the worst educational region in Britain to being the best as Minister for Schools. Having said that, when I look at my International Rescue Committee experience, we've gone from being a $400 million NGO that most people hadn't heard of to an $800 million NGO that is the leading impact evaluation agency in the humanitarian sector. So I don't know is the truth. I think it takes longer in an NGO. The CEO lifespan is not quite as short as football coaches, but it's short. And so I think it takes this long to put your mark on it. But then people start saying, well, once you reach 7, 8, 9 years, you've got to think what's the future. And I try not to get too bogged down by that, because we're all living in the present because of COVID, and we're stuck in my wife's study. I mean, I'm lucky compared to many. She's not lucky that I pushed her out of her study, but you've got more agency, I think, if you're in an NGO, because it's more down to you. If you're in politics, so much else can go wrong that may or may not be your fault.
And do you feel, I mean, people who've left politics or, been, former leaders, former prime ministers, often say, well, I've learned all this stuff and then I'm not using it anymore because I've been ejected. Do you have a sense of that as well? Sort of that you would perhaps now be a better leader than you might have been actually when you were seeking the job?
Well, I mean, look, John Major famously said this, that his post-prime ministerial career, he would have argued, look, if you say the opposite, you're saying you've learned nothing, which would be a bizarre thing to say. So, hopefully every year that you live, you become a more rounded person. I mean, it would be very sad to think, a year's gone by and I'm actually a worse person than I was, or a less well capacitated person than I was a year before. So hopefully, the older you get, the older your children get, the more conscious you become of your own flaws. They don't hesitate to explain them.
And when you look at the Labour Party right now, is it a place you feel at home in again?
Yes, I mean, I'm a member of the Labour Party. I actually never left the Labour Party, notwithstanding the depredations of the Corbyn years. But we're heading back towards being a serious political party. I mean, the truth about it's incredible to think Britain's had 4 elections and 2 referendums in the period since we left government in 2010. But the sense that Labour has been unelectable means that you don't have a democracy then. And that's a very serious state of affairs. And I never believed that Jeremy Corbyn was going to get elected. It just wasn't going to happen. People weren't going to vote for him. And the fact that we've now got a leader who's serious about power, not for its own sake, but in order to make a difference, to change the world, to at least change Britain, that's obviously a very important if you believe in the values of the Labour Party. It's also important for the political stability of the country.
And can you see a path for them to win? I mean, what would your envelope plan be?
Well, I don't think that's quite the way I'd put it. But the path to win is you've got to be radical and credible. Radical because there are big things that need change in the UK and in the wider world. Credible because the bigger the change you're proposing, the more it's incumbent on you to make sure you're not taking a risk with other people's lives. Because if you do, they won't trust you to do it. And so that's easy to say. Now, we're going to be living in probably the most testing period for British government, and certainly since the Second World War, really, where you've got the economic deindustrialization of COVID, you've got the COVID consequences itself, you've got the challenges of Brexit, which nobody is talking about, never mind the foreign security and other intelligence relationships that we need, immigration relationships we need with the European Union. You've got Brexit and its aftermath, and you've got all of the political reverberations, including the Scottish question. That makes this a very, very challenging period. And how you put together a majority government becomes very difficult in those circumstances. The warning, obviously, from America is that a government failure on COVID doesn't guarantee that it will lose support. And so I don't underestimate the challenge at all. But I think that Keir Starmer and his team have made a really strong start.
And can you see a way on Brexit, given you and lots of senior people in the Labour Party right now still think this is a disaster, that Britain shouldn't be doing it, and that there's no good outcomes here? How do you politically turn that into a sellable message? Why do you not just fall back into the same, they don't believe in Brexit, they don't believe in what we voted for, they're never going to make a success of it?
Well, because you don't spend your time saying what a disaster it's going to be. You say this is how to avoid it being a disaster. And for it to be damaging but not a disaster would be a step forward. And so whether it be in respect of how Britain is aligned with on services with the EU, I mean, look, I'll give you a small example. by withdrawing from the REACH directive, which is what documents chemicals, Britain has to invent its own chemical registration system, which is going to cost £1 billion a year to the chemical industry, right? So in every sector of the economy, on refugees, Britain is going to have to renegotiate with the rest of Europe what it does about sending people back who previously registered as refugees in Greece or Italy. So in every sphere of national life, we're going to have to renegotiate. And the truth about the 21st century is you're going to have a big American bloc, a big Chinese bloc, and a big European bloc. We're not going to have a big British bloc. So I think that we don't spend our time saying Brexit is a disaster. I wouldn't do that at all. I say Brexit is bringing massive challenges and they need to be addressed. And it's incumbent on a serious government to address them. But where we are now, though, is we're not even clear if we're going to get a deal. I think we will get a shell deal. But I think that it just means that the combination of radical but credible is made more difficult. That's my point.
And do you think that that is a way you can actually politically bring, these very polarized populations together?
I hope so. Because Britain we don't live in 3 time zones in Britain. We don't have the same religious differences that exist and the social differences that exist. We don't have the same, I don't underestimate the challenges around race in the UK, but we don't have the same history that the US have of a civil war fought 150 years ago, some of whose consequences have never been properly played out. So I think that it is possible to appeal on majoritarian grounds in the UK in a way that's much more difficult here.
Our final question on this podcast is always, if you could just change the world, wave a magic wand, what would you do?
You mean this is the sort of make all my wishes come true question? Look, I think if I'm going to be consistent with where I started, or didn't start, if I'm going to be consistent with one of the answers I gave in this podcast, which is that climate is the existential question that we face, then the magic wand I would wave would be to decarbonize the economy so that we live as if there's one planet, not 3. And in the process of doing that, I don't think you just solve an environmental problem. I think that decarbonization is a route to more equality in incomes because you can create jobs that way. I think it's a way to live as a connected world with global institutions that are able to manage the global commons. I think it's the most encompassing agenda. So if I'm allowed one wish, it would be in that sphere, consistent with another point I made, which is that we are exercising power without responsibility in respect of the environment. What we're doing in respect of putting carbon emissions in the atmosphere is impunity, because the planet has no votes and the future has no votes. And so we are acting with impunity in putting greenhouse gas in the atmosphere that stay there for 100 years. That's impunity. And so my answer to your question would be to focus on the existential generational challenge around living as if there's one planet, not 3.
David Miliband, thank you very much indeed for joining us and for sharing your ways to change the world. Our producer is Rachel Evans. You can watch all of these interviews on the Channel 4 News YouTube channel. Until next time, bye-bye.